Hey, Kat, welcome to the Ultimate QA podcast. Super nice to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So I am the head of GXP Quality Assurance at Egnyte, which is a content management platform. And I've been with the company for about 2 years now, but I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years, doing everything from clinical supply chain to partnerships and alliances, data analytics, and IoT management.
Beautiful. And so when you say a content management system, I was checking it out a little bit before the interview. Is it like a WordPress alternative?
Not so much WordPress. Some of our main competitors are Viva or Box, or interestingly enough, SharePoint. As a Microsoft partner, they realize the limitations they have. And so, I like to think of it as a souped up collaboration platform, something, that you do every day that can be so frustrating of sending a file through email and waiting for your partners to send it back. Our platform allows you to assign and invite people to collaborate on your content and manage that in a GXP compliant manner and traceability, and making sure that everybody is working from the same page. And then on top of that, it adds data governance so that you can ensure the right users have the right access to the information and that no sensitive information gets out into the ether where you don't want it.
Okay, cool. And you mentioned the term that I'm not familiar with, GXP quality. What is that?
Yeah. So within the life sciences, particularly when you're working in clinical trials, there are the good manufacturing practices, clinical practices, laboratory practices. So we abbreviate them all as X, but basically regulatory compliance across the world of how information, particularly around those involved in clinical trials, needs to be managed and retained.
Okay. So it's all about managing the information.
Managing the information, controlling it. One of the big regulatory requirements, as I alluded to, is traceability. Can you go through the audit log of your computerized system and understand who did what when? And so, making sure that there weren't any bad actors. But in particular, once a clinical trial is done and you need to archive that data, you need to prove nobody changed it after the fact, that nobody
Mm.
went in there and said, actually, this trial would be more successful if we just tweak that a little bit. And so having that proof of retention through the regulatory requirements and that nobody has changed it.
Wow, amazing. I've never encountered this topic. How do you handle that? How do you deal with, I guess, creating this kind of traceability and then ensuring that the data remains in a, I guess, what would you call it, uncorrupted state?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, today's computerized systems have come a long way in being able to track information and users and activities in audit logs, but then making that information within the audit log accessible to the common everyday person. There's a lot of systems out there right now that you need a computer programming degree in order to understand what's in that audit log. But now you can simply query that. You can use intelligence now, in the whole world of AI and chat GPT world, being able to interrogate your data and just say, hey, across, all of these documents, who was the last person in it? What kind of changes did they make? Just being able to have that sense of control over your information. And in particular, if you're up in a regulatory inspection, having that inspector ask you a question saying, okay, this change was dated April 15th. When was it implemented into your documents? And so being able to answer those questions readily and easily is a real benefit.
Cool. And so are you all using AI to help with that process?
So our platform does have AI built into it. Originally, Ignite focused on cybersecurity and ransomware protection, being able to ensure that nobody can hold your data hostage. And they use AI to keep ahead of the hackers, right? So, where is a potential malware threat? Where is there potential bad actors? Like, Nikolai, you downloaded 20 documents yesterday. You've never downloaded more than two. Are you thinking of leaving? Right. So using that AI and machine learning that has been in the platform, we've also then, tapped into more modern abilities to interrogate data so that you can go into a complex clinical trial protocol and just ask the system, what's the age group for the patients in this trial? What's the recommended doses? Instead of saying, is that on page 13 or page 20 or page 200? But then even to like go across many documents. So if you're writing a protocol on, let's say, atrial fibrillation, right? And you bring in a lot of more recent articles, you can bring those into a knowledge base and you can say, hey, based on all of these research articles, what are the primary targets for AFib? Right. So things like that, and being able to use that and surface that to the everyday user.
Mm, sounds very similar to the modern day LLMs that we're familiar with, like the Chat GPTs or the Claudes or Geminis, right? Where they already have an access to a knowledge base, which is the external world, and then we can supply it more information and query that information. Are you all, I guess, how did you all implement this kind of system? Are you leveraging the current fundamental LLMs or did you all create your own?
Yeah, so Egnyte has largely built our own natural language management and machine learning systems. Obviously, our developers are tuned in to what's out there in the ether. The important thing is that our customers be reassured that we're bringing AI to their data and not taking their data to AI. So, whatever models or programs that we use, they're inherent to the platform and they only look at a customer's data one customer at a time and it never goes beyond.
That makes sense. So it was for basically data privacy and security issues. Is that the only way to create such kind of a system? Are there no ways to like control whether these other fundamental LLMs, whether what kind of data they have access to?
Well, I can't talk to anybody else's AI models, but there certainly are a large number of them. Even ChatGPT, you can have a private instance, right? And say, you come to my data, but don't take my data out into the ether. So I think that's becoming more and more of an element across the whole implementation of more, everyday user friendly AI. Because obviously AI has been around as long as computers have been around. It's just that what's novel about the Chat GPT and in particular 4.0 is that it made it accessible to everyday users to use. And it's transforming everybody's lives. We've seen that day to day. And it's exciting because it helps people in their jobs be more strategic and less worried about the mundane. I was like, oh, I've got to write up this report based on these findings. Instead, you can get a little boost and assist and say, hey, AI, based on this these findings, write me a preliminary report. And then you can go through and tweak it and put in, the elements that you know that AI didn't.
Yeah, great point. And that leads me to a conversation I've had a number of times with different kinds of people now. Some people say that AI is going to make people lazier. Other people, like, I think yes. Some people, yes, for sure. And I think others, it will allow them to do more. The people that use it to basically do the mundane tasks in order to accelerate their movement towards a higher purpose or a bigger vision. So I think it's like goes both ways. What do you think from your experience?
I think you're right. You know, it really just depends on the person themselves and kind of their natural tendencies, right? If you're the kind of person that is like, no, I'll put that off to the last minute because I don't like doing it. If that can then bring that work forward so that you can move on more quickly, right? Then you increase your efficiency and your productivity. On the other hand, there are people like, well, now I don't have to work so hard and I can go get that extra cup of coffee or read the newspaper instead of, industry news or something like that. Then you're always going to have those people. But I think that's part of good hiring.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. I totally agree. I recently, so this last week I've been interviewing for a senior automation engineer at our organization, the Ultimate QA, because we're replacing one of the engineers at one of our customers in Europe. And so I've been interviewing. I think we got over like almost 150 applications, and I've been interviewing almost 10 engineers in person that went through a number of different stages after they passed the online assessments. they're supposed to be senior engineers. They're coming in with like 10 years of experience, sometimes more. But I'm finding that a lot of them don't have the basic fundamentals. Like many of them are struggling with like loops or try catch blocks. And a lot of them tend to hint that they want to go to AI to solve their challenges. And I'm like, yeah, of course you have AI outside of this assessment, but we want to see how you think so that you, whenever you do come across challenges, we know that you can resolve them versus using AI as a crutch. And it made me start to wonder, I'm like, wow, is AI really like making a lot of people lazier?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I was at a conference the other day and it was promoting how you didn't need to understand Python because the AI was going to write the Python code for you, and all you had to do was cut and paste it over into, uh, you know, uh, yeah, open box script. And I was like, but I'm looking at that. I know a little Python, not a lot. And I'm not sure what that script is doing. So how does this person who doesn't know Python at all evaluate whether or not that script is actually going to do what they want to do when it just came back with an answer of yes or no? They were using it to like show that a molecule would or would not pass the blood-brain barrier based on, information about the molecule and what gets across. And it literally just came back with an answer of yes or no. And I'm like, Hmm. I don't know.
That's super interesting. For that kind of situation, I actually had another interesting experience. There's this uh app called lovable.dev. I don't know if you ever used it.
Uh-uh.
I learned about it like a week ago at a tech meetup. But basically you can it's like a chat GPT, but it's made to build web applications. And so you give it a prompt and it can quickly build your web application. And so I had it build me two different web applications. One was a goal tracker where like a vision board, because I've never found a good vision board app. And so it's always been in the back of my head, but I never had the time. And so I tried it and it did a good job. And then the other one I built was like a one where I answer questions in the morning and the evening in order to basically help me focus my day. And then in the evening to review my day in terms of what I can improve for next time. And it got stuck on this one problem where basically it doesn't update the history. And I went through maybe 10 to 20 iterations of trying to tell it that history saving is not working. It's basically stuck on one date and it doesn't save any more entries. And it's stuck and it can't get out of it. And so I'm realizing like, okay, amazing. It created this code, but it's not working as expected. And so now what? So now it's like still need an engineer to get in there, figure out what actually went wrong and to fix it in order to make the app work as we want it to work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing that I say about AI to everyone is there's some fundamentals to know, and you need that training and that background, because if you don't have clean data, it's classic garbage in, garbage out. AI is going to give you nothing if your data is incomprehensible or all over the place or inconsistent. But then the second thing is I like to call AI machines hungry cookie monsters, because they always want more and they need more, right? And so you're going to get to the point where it can only go so far. To your point, like it gets stuck at this load of history and it can't accept more. But AI is always looking for more and always wanting to have more reinforcement. And a lot of people are using these models like ChatGPT, even in the open, and they don't give it feedback. They don't say, yes, this was right, or no, this was wrong. And without that feedback, it doesn't actually perform to its best abilities.
Yeah, wonderful point. Kat, you also mentioned something that I thought was very interesting. You said there are fundamentals of AI that we need to know and learn. Do you have thoughts on what that is and where we can get that kind of training?
I am starting to see more and more fundamental trainings. I haven't looked at it myself, but I did notice that LinkedIn Learning has a couple elements and certificates now for maybe some AI basics. But I'm sure we're going to see a lot more popping up, because I've heard more and more from different people in my network that they realize that being able to use AI and use it effectively is a skill set that they're starting to try to bring into the workforce.
Yeah, it seems to be becoming like a fundamental skill set because it can help with so many areas as we talked about earlier, like the mundane. Yeah, I'm using it to, for example, I recently was speaking with a company about doing some work for them. And so I worked side by side with Claude. Claude has a bunch of information about my organization. So it has a nice context about what we're doing. I use it to help me write a proposal in way faster time than I would have myself. And so like I collaborated with it back and forth. And so like those kinds of things are possible in so many areas that I feel like if organizations aren't utilizing AI, they'll just be moving so much slower than those that are.
Yeah. And the trick for any organization is to come up with that AI strategy. Where in your business do you need help with efficiency and optimization where AI tools might help accelerate that? But then, be conscious of the fact that there are areas where AI may actually slow it down, right? And may corrupt the process. Certainly if you're a patient in a clinical trial and you find out that your protocol was written entirely by AI engine, you're going to be a little bit hesitant versus if you know it was written and reviewed by 10 qualified physicians that have 15 years of experience in your disease.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's a good caveat to make a statement that the work of AI should always be reviewed by a human still, even I I think it's critical because AI does make mistakes and it makes mistakes all the time. And so you can't fully trust it. And so to me it's like another a I don't know, a less intelligent it has a breadth of knowledge, but a lot of times not a depth of knowledge in many topics. And so to me it's like a sidekick. You can take in the input, but you also have to collaborate in order to ensure that the input is good.
Well, it kind of gets us back to being in quality, right? Trust but verify.
Yeah,
Always
that's what
verify.
yeah. That's a great segue actually to we went on this AI tangent, but I'm very curious about so you're leading GXP quality at your organization. What does that actually entail? Like, I guess maybe at a high level, what are your objectives for what you do? And then how do you implement those? How do you implement initiatives to move towards those objectives?
Yeah. So, I think our customers rely on us to ensure that the system that they're getting is meeting regulatory requirements and is continuously maintained in a compliant state. One of the things that has evolved in our computerized systems over the years is agile development. And so, in a classic world, computer systems weren't updated very often. You were very aware of the changes coming. You had this long lead way of making sure that change was appropriate. But in today's environment, there could be a new release every day, typically every week or every month. But in classic processes that a lot of organizations still have, they were like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of change control. So, what my team really does is to try to take that heavy lifting off of our customers so that they can be confident that the system is being maintained continuously in a compliant state. And that means we work very closely with the developers to understand new features that are coming to the environment, how they might affect our GXP compliance of the platform, and if necessary, stage it for our customers so that they have time to understand that change and accept that before we release it. So, a large part of what we do is validation. We do a risk based validation. We completely work off of a computer system assurance framework versus a more traditional document heavy focus and more strategic in our thinking based on risk. So, for example, if our platform changed a button from blue to red, I don't care. It goes through our regular quality control and testing, and we know it's going to be red and it's consistently going to be red. But if they change the way that the user sets up their credentials and has to reprogram the password every 90 days, then we care about that. And we're going to put that through its paces. So doing that risk-based approach, we can focus on what matters and we can move faster and more agile along with these weekly releases.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so how are you all you mentioned you're using a computer system to help with that?
So there's two ways of thinking about validation. There's the classic computer system validation framework, which is entirely based on GAMP 5 principles of, how much is the system customized or configured, or is it out of the box? Computer system assurance guidance came out a while back, and it says instead of focusing on, I need a requirements document, I need a trace matrix, I need these test cases, think about what is the system doing as a whole? What makes sense? And then write the documents based on that plan. So, for example, in a classic system, functional requirements would just be iterated like the system does this, the system does this, the system does that. In a critical thinking, it's okay, well, let's organize all of these UX elements that have absolutely nothing to do with regulatory requirements. Just group them and say, you know what, we're not revalidating them. They're already tested and they have nothing to do. And then you get to a chunk and say, okay, here are the configurable elements. This is what makes it a category 3 versus a category 4 system. And then the last one is these are the things that might get customized, right? And then these raise up to that next level. So instead of just saying your whole system is one thing or the other, actually break the pieces of the system into those elements and focus your validation where it matters most.
Wow, super interesting. And so then who goes through the exercise of breaking the system down into these components?
Yeah, so my team works really closely with the product to understand, how interwoven are these things? Is it completely separate? And like if I just took this code out of the system, it's going to have absolutely no impact. Or are there touch points and how they interrelate? So knowing the product and how it's coded is really an important step to putting that risk-based approach into it. And then understanding the regulations. What is 21? What is Annex 11 saying? What are some of these other guidelines around AI asking us to verify and understand? And so we take that and then we go into each functional requirement and we actually place the risk on that. And that way our customers know if it's negligible, we're not retesting it again in our validation efforts. If it's low, we're just going to do happy path. We're going to just make sure, yep, and when I click that button, it works. If it's medium, we're going to make sure not only when we click the button it works, but when we don't click the button, this happens. And then in high risk, we not only test all of the positive scenarios, the negative scenarios, but we try to think of every single scenario that might come across, right? So like doing a workflow, maybe you have a to-do task and then a workflow review and then an approval. So, okay, great, that all worked. Now we're going to go from to do to approval. Does it still work? Are we going to go this way to that way? So, you know, putting the scrutiny where it's best met.
That makes sense. And just so I understand better, um, who's part of your team? Like what kind of roles?
Great question. So we have two validation specialists that focus on writing our test scripts and executing those. And then I have a quality assurance team that is focused on the quality management framework that we operate in, our SOPs and policies, and do a lot of the review of the validation plans and the summary reports to make sure that what the testers have seen and attested to is accurate and that we have adequate evidence that our customers are going to need. And that quality assurance team also does a lot of the risk assessments and working with the product team to understand what's coming and how to change it.
Okay, cool. So you all are doing some automated testing then.
Our organization does do automated testing. Within our validation efforts, we are going there next. A lot of it right now has been still manual, and that goes with just making sure all of the frameworks and the fundamentals are there. As I said, I came to the organization about 2 years ago, and so since I've been at Egnyte, I have moved us more into this risk-based approach and getting all of the fundamentals there. And now that that is all done and we have good new packages on all of our platform. Now we're going to be moving into for regression testing or periodic review, where can we move those into automated testing so that we can trust but verify that another system is testing our system?
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's a logical progression of. And so, how often are you all releasing today?
So our platform is subject to weekly releases for our core collaboration platform, every other week for our security elements, and then quarterly for some of our life science modules. We have a ETMF and we have an electronic quality management system as well.
Okay. And so then, if you're saying that most of the work is still manual today, then I'm assuming there is no continuous integration kind of setup that exists yet. Is that right?
In our validation testing, so on our core SDLC, then there's a lot of automation testing. In fact, we produce for our customers the results of daily performance qualification automation that is conducted as part of the core SDLC.
What do you mean by that? I don't understand.
Sure. So, in terms of developing new features or changing features and then testing those to make sure that they work, that's all under our core SDLC. So, when my team gets the product, it's already been developed and tested
Mm.
and ready for release. Then we go through that additional scrutiny of regulatory compliance and retesting them again, not just to make sure they work, but making sure they don't fail.
Okay. And so when your team gets it, you said it's already been developed and tested. Is that by the developers
Developers, and there's another quality organization that does
and another quality organization? And so you all are the
that.
last step.
Yep.
Okay. The last step in the process. Yeah. Okay. And so then do you know how much testing the developers are doing? Because, like the risk-based thing a lot of times makes sense to me because I mean it's a logical way to approach a testing situation because you can't test everything and you'll never have enough resources to test everything. And so then the question is like, how do you prioritize it? Well, a risk-based seems to make sense because it's like, well, let's put in the effort where there's potentially the most downside and avoid those downsides and not waste a lot of time on things that aren't super valuable. But then there's organizations I think that like will basically just write a lot of tests, like maybe like a Facebook or an Amazon, they'll have engineers that will do a lot of automation. And then if there's a bug, they'll try to fix it as quickly as possible and just release it to production as quickly as possible. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's like a risk-based testing approach. It's more like, hey, let me test as much stuff as I think makes sense. And then if there's a problem, I'll quickly fix it.
Yeah. So I think, one thing that I love about this company and why I came here is it works across a lot of customers that are subject to regulatory scrutiny. So, one of our biggest verticals is in architecture and construction. And let me tell you, I've learned a lot about how heavily they are regulated. It gives me a little confidence in
Yeah.
when I walk into a building now, and also the financial services and then life sciences. So every customer that we touch does have a regulatory component to stand up to. And so I think for that perspective, Egnyte probably is pretty heavy-handed in our testing than something like Amazon, where if you don't get your delivery on time, you might give them some forgiveness. Building collapses or, the financial markets go down, that might be a little bit harder to recover from. So there is a lot of scrutiny, and every line of code within Egnyte is double reviewed
Wow.
and tested.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense, right? It certainly does depend on the industry, right? Like you said, I remember having a conversation with someone like, for example, even in terms of like usability of a user interface, for example, for a bank, it's not as important to have a great user experience because once you're in a bank and you're using it and you're doing direct deposits and paying bills, if their UI is terrible, it's not easy to leave. You're not gonna switch banks probably just because their UI is it. But if like Amazon has a terrible UI, they're not gonna be able to get users and get sales, and so that'll impact their revenue. And so there, it's like critical to get that right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. That makes sense. And so then, your team being like the last line of defense in the system, what kind of testing are you all doing? Like, is it Do you guys, I think you mentioned you're looking at the UI. Are you all doing like API testing, accessibility, security? How does that look?
Yeah. So, as I said, we primarily base it on the regulatory requirements around clinical trials, in particular, electronic signatures and, you know, inserting reasons for change into the audit trail. Those are key things. So we would go in and set up different scenarios and edits and ensure that those edits were traceable through the system after the fact and that the system processed that data. As I talked about, there's retention, right? So if we set the retention policy to 5 years and I go and I try to delete that file and make sure that it doesn't get deleted. So there's a lot of that elements that go into, a lot of the effort is thinking through these scenarios of like, how are people going to use the system? We know how it functions, but how are they actually going to use it and try to break it? And that's what I love to do the most is just try to break it, right?
And how often are you all breaking the system?
We've broken it a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where-
I'm actually always proud when my team finds something that slipped through, but I'm happy to say nothing that's like majorly catastrophic, but you know, something we're like, "Hey, we noticed that."
Uh, yeah, that's cool. And so are these activities like mostly UI based, or is it like, are you in a console reviewing logs? Like, what does that look like?
So we have several environments of our platform and we test across different configurations. I said we kind of break it out into what matters. So we have probably 8 different environments that are all configured in different ways. And we'll test across those different configurations just to make sure that it's consistently working. Or if the configuration does affect that test, that we see the change. So that's, a lot of thought going into just being curious about the system. Like, well, what happens, when I move this folder and I had this link to it? Does the link still find it or does it get broken? Right. And so just thinking through those different scenarios.
How do you get your team to think critically like that? And because of course, I think you can overtest as well. You can create scenarios that don't make sense and that should not be spent time on. So it's like it's an interesting balance I found always too. How do you find that nice balance and how do you get your team to think?
Is. And, what we found helpful is, we work as a team. It's really important to understand thinking. And for test cases, go to a fundamental outline and say, okay, here's the requirement I'm trying to test. Here's the risk. So I know I need just positive. Great. Go through the positive. And then as a reviewer, you can go through and say, but isn't that a negative? Do we really need that? Or thinking through those scenarios. For example, we had one about a month ago and somebody set up the test case and the reviewer went through and said, is that really going to work? And they're like, what's wrong with it? And they're like, well, I think if you turn this off, it's going to do the same thing. So you haven't really proven that this is on and this is what's going to happen. So, going through that review process, breaking it down into its fundamentals. But sometimes we go back to just common sense. So, one of the exercises I did with my team is I had them write a test script for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And, it came to the questions of, is that a critical thing that you need to tell the tester? Or is it something that you can expect them to understand? For example, we could have had fun when it says spread the peanut butter from a jar of peanut butter and not had the step of opening the jar. And it's like, well, if you can't open the jar, you're not going to get to the peanut butter and therefore you won't spread the peanut butter. So, no, you probably don't have to tell them to open the peanut butter jar. But it probably does matter if you put 2 tablespoons of peanut butter on the knife or a teaspoon of whether or not you're going to get enough peanut butter on the bread. And so that's where the detail matters. And so sometimes when you break things down just to everyday things, to just say, is that something that's common sense? And you can rely that the tester is going to know to open the jar. But when it comes to how much pressure to apply that you don't rip the bread, or you get that perfect balance of peanut butter and jelly, those are where the details matter. And so that kind of helped them go through more critical thinking just to think about something they do on an everyday basis.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. What a great exercise of constructing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and thinking about that as a test case. How do you measure success for yourself and your team?
Oh, that's great. So, yeah, one of the things I'm kind of proud about that I established with the team was an expectation matrix. And I share this across the entire team, independent of their role, and say, this is what we expect of this person in their role. This is what we expect of this person in this role. And it really ties into giving collaborative feedback to each other. And so every quarter, based on this matrix, we give feedback to each other and say, hey, I know in your role, I'm expected to have a good understanding of what you're doing this week. And I have to admit, last week, I had no idea what you were doing. Right. And so not from a point of criticizing, but from a point of how did that affect you? Right. And say, well, yeah, last week I didn't know what you were doing, but honestly, I was doing my own thing and it didn't affect me. So it doesn't matter. Versus, I didn't know what you were doing and I was waiting on you. Right. And then encouraging them not to wait for that quarterly review, but to give it real time. Like we meet as a team once, twice a week sometimes to really go through the projects, make sure that we're all aligned, what we can depend on each other for. And then it's those updates that are critical, especially when we're in a critical delivery, right? Then we might have daily updates in our channel to say, okay, yes, this one's ready for review. This one's ready to be executed versus, we might be in, kind of a stage where we're waiting for the next piece of features and there's a little bit of downtime and then it's like, oh, hey, let's go back and just double check this or start working on this side project, but keeping an eye on what's coming next. So I think it's all about transparency of what you expect from people, what you expect from your peers and your colleagues, and as a team as a whole.
And so, what's part of this matrix? What do you put in there?
So things that we put in there are communication styles, idle time, and I have personal development. Have you spent 5% of your week going through personal development? What can your team members help you work on? So, if I have a team member who's in the validation testing, but they're interested in understanding more about audits, great. We have an audit coming up and you have some downtime, come observe the audit or vice versa, right? I had, somebody on the audit side wanted to actually go through and execute a test case. So we found one that she could do and go through and take ownership of. So, things like that, I think.
Okay, awesome. And does your organization have any kind of like metrics or KPIs that they track for quality assurance? Even I know some like organizations may work towards like the DORA metrics. Others may have like bug escape velocity. Do you all have any such kind of metrics?
They certainly do within the SDLC. Within my team, we are really looking towards for audits, right? No critical findings, nothing in major that we would have missed. If somebody finds something major, I want it to have been found in an internal audit first. So, what are we finding in our internal audits? Obviously, a lacking of critical issues. But then, for us, because we get the product after it's already ready to release, there's a speed element to what my team has to do so that our customers aren't waiting an exorbitant amount of time to get those new features validated. So we are working more and more towards in process validation so that as it's going through enough testing to be confident that it's not going to have bugs coming to us, can we get our validation turned around in a matter of days so that it can still go through to release?
Do you find it that as time goes on and your product becomes more robust and adds more features, that it becomes harder and harder to test everything you need in the time that you want?
Some things can be pretty complicated, that's for sure. Our security and data governance module, I think, was a big undertaking for us that we underestimated. And it really got into that curiosity. It's like, well, what happens if you have an archive policy and you put a delete policy on top of it, is it going to archive it or delete it? Right. Okay, well, if it's supposed to archive after a day and delete after 3 days, then no, it should never be deleted. It should always be archived. But if you delete after a day and archive after three, it's probably gone. So it's those nuances of like, how do all of these policies work together, that gets a little bit more complicated. But I think, again, I go back, is you got to have a really good relationship with your product managers and understand with the engineering team, what did you touch, right? We told you there was an audit trail finding, what did you have to touch in order to fix that, right? And having them really think through that and say, oh, yeah, well, you wanted us to enumerate who was in the groups. So we had to touch group permissions. Great. We're going to go back and we're going to regress group permissions. So it's just having that intimate knowledge of the platform. And one of the things that helps is my team uses our platform every single day to do our work.
Yeah, that's great. And so are you getting into the situation of having too much to test and not enough time, or you find that you guys can just maintain your regular pace over time?
Well, I think the way that we have it set up, because we do risk-based and understand, what's coming in the pipe. So we already know what's coming through this
Right.
whole year
Hmm.
and what's going to come this quarter, what's going to come this month. So we are always continuously preparing for that and making sure that validation efforts are set up. So I'll give an example. For our EQM, we knew there was a whole bunch of changes coming to add new customized statuses and workflow processes. So we went through an end-to-end validation at the beginning of this year to make sure that we've confirmed everything is working. And so when this change comes and we know what it touches, we just have to test those because we have everything else to come back to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good balance, because I find that through my work at Ultimate QA and before, the typical situation for most customers is, for most organizations is, they'll start supporting some kind of a platform, and then the platform will grow in size because it keeps adding new features, new capabilities, but the team sizes stay the same, but the amount of test cases grows. And maybe it's because they're not following a risk-based approach. They basically just have a list of test cases, and that list just keeps growing and growing. And at a certain point, they say, okay, we can't keep up with this. So it's like either delay releases, which is usually not acceptable, or hire more people, or how do we make our current individuals more efficient, which usually then leads to automation. And then maybe now the next step is, how do we integrate AI into our processes to become even more efficient?
Yeah. I mean, I think a critical thing for my group was going back and switching to this risk-based strategy and being able to go into each functional requirement and assess that risk so that our product managers know, if you're going to touch workflow, this is a high risk area for us. Right off the bat, we're going to have to validate it. We need to understand what the changes are here more in depth versus over here, in the dashboard. I'm like, you can do whatever you want with that dashboard. I don't care, right? I'm not going to retest it. You can just, make iterative or one big change, So I think it's that transparency and understanding and making sure that everybody's on the same page. But to your point, if you have a product that is going to be going through a lot of change and you're not taking a risk-based approach, that you're doing end-to-end testing every single time, you're going to have to keep growing your organization.
Your organization, or figuring out how to make the individuals more efficient with the tooling, which is what I find now, especially nowadays in today's world and economy. That's where many organizations are moving towards, is they're like, we're not hiring more people. We want our people to be more efficient. And so then it's basically a automation approach, or like what we've been working on is building out this platform called QAI, which is basically using AI to help implement automation so that organizations can just add the tool versus adding more headcount.
Yeah. But you still have to keep up with the tools, right? Because
Yes, of
if
course.
you're changing your user interface, one of the biggest problems with those automated tools is they are click by click. And so if the click moves from the left corner to the right corner, you have to rewrite that automation script.
Rewrite or re-record, or
Right.
if it's an intelligent system, we don't have end-to-end UI testing yet. we're tackling this problem of automated API test generation, which I think is a easier problem to solve because it's not as dynamic as UI. But like, if we when we will go into the end-to-end UI testing portion, it will be like either record based, which is seems to be the most logical way to do it. Basically, just have a user walking through the scenario and have an intelligent way of recording not everything. That's what we're finding is like a lot of tools fail on is they'll record everything. And so then sometimes you might open a website and you accidentally click somewhere you didn't want to click there. You want to click somewhere else, but that gets recorded, and now that's part of your script. And now you got to go back, figure out what's working, what's correct, what's not correct, clean it up, and it becomes a mess. And so, an intelligent way of recording, or another thing that we were thinking about that can be done is like if you have like a publicly facing website, you can track users as they move through your website and the different journeys, and now you have almost like a heat map of the
Mm.
kind of flows that they're performing. And you can, of course, have like flows that are happen way less often and flows that happen way more often. And then you turn those into scenarios automatically. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think it's a great use of those tools. One of the things when I was in IoT software that we talked about is could you record the customer's user acceptance testing so that when you make a change and they've got to go through that testing again, they could just hit rerun last one. And I want to make sure all that works still, right? And then I'm going to go and do this new feature and record that. So, and as long as you don't, change the UI clicks and as you say, they don't accidentally, I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance of finding intelligence to like do it well because yeah, especially the UI testing, it's so UI dependent and the UI changes quite often a lot of times. So it's interesting, but we're excited to figure that out, the challenge, and see how it's gonna turn out. Kat, do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to impart on us before we wrap things up here?
I think in general, when you're working with computerized systems and looking for how do you have that assurance of quality and confidence in your platform, just critically think about what it's doing. What do you intend it to do and how is it going to be used? You were just talking about, users and heat maps of what they often do. And you can be actually very surprised sometimes of how your users are actually using the system versus what you intend them to use this in the system. And so sometimes it's good to just go back and bring everybody to a table and say, okay, this is how we thought everybody was going to use it, but tell me your day. Like, how are you actually using it? And put that into your testing scenario. Because if you're focused on one thing and everybody else is focused on another and something goes wrong over here, but you were focused over here, then people lose confidence in their systems. And when you lose confidence in your systems, then chaos ensues.
Yeah, beautiful point, Kat. Well, Kat, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It was such a pleasure talking to you and learning from you. I learned so much from this one because this is, I guess, it's a topic that I haven't talked about before. So thanks. And I'm sure the audience will enjoy it as well.
And thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Bye.